In one of the most unexpected and emotionally charged moments in television history, media mogul Oprah Winfrey found herself in an unforgettable exchange that would challenge her perspective and touch millions of hearts worldwide. What started as a light-hearted interview segment quickly transformed into a profound lesson about faith, perseverance, and the human spirit. When Oprah initially laughed at Rocky Balboa's unwavering belief in something greater than himself, she had no idea that within minutes, she would be moved to tears by the very conviction she had dismissed. This remarkable moment reminds us all that sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected sources, and that faith, whether in God, in ourselves, or in the possibility of redemption, can be the most transformative force in our lives. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching this from and share your thoughts on this incredible moment. Are you Team Rocky or Team Oprah? Let's get this conversation started. The stage was set for what producers thought would be a routine celebrity interview. Oprah Winfrey, the undisputed queen of daytime television, had welcomed countless guests to her iconic couch over the decades. Her ability to connect with people from all walks of life had made her a household name and a trusted voice in American culture. On this particular day, the discussion was centered around iconic movie characters and the actors who brought them to life, and naturally, the conversation turned to one of cinema's most beloved underdogs, Rocky Balboa, portrayed brilliantly by Sylvester Stallone. What made this interview different was the depth of the conversation that would unfold. Oprah, known for her spiritual curiosity and openness, began exploring the character's motivations and the philosophy that drove Rocky through impossible odds. The Italian stallion wasn't just a boxer, he was a symbol of persistence, grit, and an unshakable belief that even the most broken person could rise again. As Stallone began sharing insights about Rocky's faith, not just in his own abilities, but in a higher power that guided him through his darkest moments, something unexpected happened. Oprah's initial reaction was one of gentle skepticism, accompanied by a laugh that echoed through the studio. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but rather the kind of response that comes from someone who has seen so much of life's complexity that simple faith seems almost naive. She had interviewed world leaders, spiritual gurus, and Nobel Prize winners. The idea that a fictional boxer's simple, unadorned faith could hold profound truth seemed in that moment almost quaint to her sophisticated worldview. But Stallone didn't back down. With the same determination that Rocky showed in the ring, he began to unpack what faith meant to the character and, more importantly, what it meant to him personally. He spoke about growing up in difficult circumstances, about being rejected over 1,000 times before Rocky was finally made, about the nights when he had nothing but belief to keep him going. The studio audience grew quiet as they realized they weren't just hearing about a movie character anymore. They were witnessing a real testimony of faith in action. The cameras captured every moment of this exchange, and what they recorded would become one of the most replayed clips in television history. Social media would later explode with reactions, with millions of viewers taking sides and sharing their own faith stories. But in that moment, in that studio, something profound was beginning to unfold. Oprah's expression began to change. The confident smile started to fade, replaced by something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that she was in the presence of a truth she had too quickly dismissed. This wasn't just about Rocky Balboa anymore. It was about every person who had ever been counted out, every dreamer who had been laughed at, every believer who had been told their faith was foolish. And as Stallone continued to speak, sharing stories of how faith had carried him through personal tragedies, professional failures, and moments of deep despair, the atmosphere in the studio shifted completely. What had started as entertainment was becoming something sacred, a moment of genuine human connection and spiritual reckoning that would challenge everyone watching to reconsider what they believed about faith, perseverance, and the power of never giving up. Comment below. Have you ever been laughed at for your beliefs only to prove the doubters wrong? Share your Rocky moment with us. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. When Oprah laughed at the mention of Rocky's simple faith, it wasn't just a moment of television. It became a cultural flashpoint that resonated with millions of people across the globe. That laugh, captured in high definition and instantly shared across social media platforms, represented something much larger than a single reaction. It symbolized the disconnect that often exists between those who intellectualize spirituality and those who live it with raw, uncomplicated conviction. Within hours, the clip had gone viral, with viewers divided between those who understood Oprah's initial skepticism and those who felt personally wounded by what they perceived as dismissiveness toward genuine faith. The reaction was swift and intense. Religious communities across denominations shared the clip with comments ranging from disappointment to understanding. Many pointed out that Oprah herself had built a career on exploring spirituality, making her initial dismissal all the more surprising. Had she become so sophisticated in her spiritual journey that she had lost touch with the simple, childlike faith that many people still hold dear? Others came to her defense, noting that her laugh seemed to come from a place of surprise rather than mockery, and that everyone deserves the grace to have their perspectives challenged and changed. What made this moment particularly powerful was its timing in our cultural conversation about faith. In an era where traditional religious beliefs are often treated with suspicion or relegated to the private sphere, here was a fictional character, Rocky Balboa, being held up as an example of authentic faith lived out loud. Rocky never preached or pontificated. He simply believed, and that belief carried him through every impossible fight, every devastating loss, every moment when logic said he should stay down. His faith wasn't sophisticated or theological. It was visceral and real, the kind of faith that gets you off the canvas when every bone in your body is telling you to quit. Social media became a battleground of opinions. The hashtag #RockyFaith began trending within an hour, with thousands of users sharing their own stories of simple faith in the face of overwhelming odds. Professional athletes posted workout videos with Rocky quotes overlaid. Ministers used the clip in sermons. Motivational speakers incorporated it into their presentations. The laugh that Oprah had let slip had inadvertently opened a floodgate of conversation about what it means to believe in something when the world tells you you're foolish for doing so. But there was another layer to the reaction that was equally fascinating. The conversation about respect for different expressions of faith. Many commentators noted that if Rocky had been discussing Eastern philosophy or meditation practices, the laugh might never have come. Was there a bias in intellectual circles against the straightforward, uncomplicated faith that characters like Rocky represented? Were we as a society more comfortable with spirituality that required explanation than with belief that simply was? These questions sparked debates in coffee shops, online forums, and dinner tables across the country. The most poignant responses came from ordinary people who saw themselves in Rocky's faith. A single mother working 3 jobs to provide for her children wrote that Rocky's belief that tomorrow could be better than today was the only thing that kept her going. A recovering addict shared that Rocky's simple prayer before each fight had inspired him to pray again after years of thinking he wasn't worthy. A cancer patient undergoing chemotherapy posted a picture of herself watching Rocky movies in her hospital room, explaining that his faith gave her hope when medical statistics offered none. These stories poured in by the thousands, each one a testament to the power of simple, unshakable belief. What Oprah couldn't have known in that moment, what none of us could have predicted, was that her laugh would become a rallying cry for everyone who had ever been dismissed for believing in something others couldn't see. It reminded people that faith, real faith, isn't about having all the answers or impressing others with your spiritual sophistication. It's about getting up every morning and choosing to believe that your life has meaning, that your struggles have purpose, and that there's something greater than yourself worth fighting for. Rocky Balboa might be fictional, but the faith he represented was as real as it gets, and millions of people around the world were ready to defend it. Drop a comment and let us know. Has anyone ever laughed at your faith? How did you respond? Tell us your story and where you're tuning in from. As Oprah's laugh faded and the studio audience settled into an uncomfortable silence, Sylvester Stallone did something remarkable. Instead of becoming defensive or dismissive, he leaned forward with the kind of gentle intensity that had made Rocky Balboa such an enduring character. His eyes locked with Oprah's, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone listening understand that this wasn't just an actor defending a fictional character. This was a man sharing his soul. What happened next would transform the entire interview and ultimately change how millions of people thought about faith, perseverance, and the human capacity to overcome. Stallone began by acknowledging that he understood why someone might laugh. He admitted that on the surface, Rocky's faith might seem simplistic or naive, especially to people who had explored complex theological and philosophical systems. But then he said something that cut through all the intellectualism and sophistication. Sometimes the most profound truths are the simplest ones. Rocky believed because he had to believe. When you've got nothing else, no education, no advantages, no reason for anyone to believe in you, faith isn't a luxury, it's survival. The actor's voice grew stronger as he shared his own journey. He talked about sleeping in a bus station with only $30 to his name, about being told he'd never make it as an actor because of his slurred speech and droopy eyes, about writing the Rocky screenplay in 3.5 days because he was desperate and inspired in equal measure. He revealed that during those darkest days, he would pray simple prayers not unlike the ones Rocky prayed before his fights. There was no eloquence, no theological sophistication, just raw, honest conversations with God that went something like, "Please, just let me get one shot, just one chance to prove I'm not a waste." What made Stallone's testimony so powerful was its authenticity. He wasn't trying to convert anyone or prove a theological point. He was simply sharing what had carried him through impossible circumstances. He described nights when he couldn't afford to eat, when his pregnant wife was begging him to give up on his dream and take a regular job, when every agent and studio in Hollywood had rejected him. In those moments, faith wasn't an abstract concept. It was the only thing standing between him and complete despair. Rocky's faith was his faith, and his faith was Rocky's faith. They were inseparable. The studio audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. Stallone continued, explaining that when he finally got the chance to make Rocky, he poured every ounce of his own struggle into the character. Rocky's training montages weren't just about physical preparation, they were about spiritual fortification. Rocky's conversations with Adrian weren't just love scenes, they were moments of doubt being met with encouragement to believe. Rocky's prayers before fights weren't religious platitudes. They were the desperate pleas of someone who knew that talent and training could only take you so far. At some point, you had to believe in something beyond yourself. Then Stallone said something that would be quoted in churches, schools, and motivational seminars for years to come. People laugh at faith until they need it. They mock belief until they're in a situation where belief is all they have left. Rocky taught me that faith isn't about being smart or sophisticated. It's about being brave enough to hope when hope seems foolish, to believe when belief seems impossible, and to get up one more time than you've been knocked down, even when every logical part of your brain is screaming at you to stay down. As he spoke these words, something extraordinary happened. The cameras caught Oprah's expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder. Her eyes began to glisten with tears. This wasn't the carefully curated emotion she sometimes displayed for effect. This was genuine, unexpected feeling breaking through the armor of her public persona. She had interviewed thousands of people about faith, spirituality, and human potential. But something about Stallone's raw honesty, his willingness to be vulnerable about his own struggles and doubts, was reaching her in a way that more polished presentations never had. Stallone wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and showed Oprah something he had never shared publicly before. A photograph of himself from 1975, gaunt and desperate, standing in front of the church where he had gone to pray before writing the Rocky screenplay. He explained that in that church he had made a deal with God. He said, "If you give me one chance, just one chance to make something of my life, I promise I'll never forget where I came from. I'll never forget that it was faith, not talent, that saved me." The emotion in the studio was now palpable, with crew members wiping their eyes and audience members openly weeping. We want to hear from you. Comment below. When has faith gotten you through an impossible situation? Share your testimony and tell us where you're watching from. One of the most fascinating aspects of the conversation that unfolded between Oprah and Stallone was the revelation that Rocky Balboa's faith, while appearing simple on the surface, actually contained profound theological and philosophical depth. As Stallone elaborated on the character's spiritual foundation, it became clear that what many had dismissed as simplistic was actually sophisticatedly simple, a crucial distinction that speaks to the heart of authentic religious experience. This section of the interview would go on to be analyzed by theologians, philosophers, and cultural critics as an unexpected masterclass in understanding the relationship between intellectual faith and lived faith. Stallone explained that when he was developing Rocky's character, he drew inspiration from various religious and philosophical traditions, without being bound to any single dogma. Rocky's faith was informed by his Italian Catholic upbringing, but it transcended denominational boundaries to touch on universal spiritual truths. The character's belief wasn't about ritual or doctrine. It was about relationship, with God, with himself, with others. This kind of faith, Stallone argued, is actually more sophisticated than many give it credit for because it requires constant, active choice in the face of doubt rather than passive acceptance of comfortable dogma. The actor dove deep into specific scenes from the Rocky films to illustrate his point. He talked about the moment in the first film when Rocky visits the pet shop and talks to Adrian about faith and fear. That scene, often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic boxing sequences, actually contains one of the most profound statements about belief in the entire franchise. Rocky says that he knows he can't beat Apollo Creed, but if he can just go the distance, if he can still be standing when the final bell rings, then he'll know he wasn't just another bum from the neighborhood. That statement, Stallone explained, is essentially a theology of grace, understanding that victory isn't always about winning, but about enduring, about refusing to quit, about maintaining dignity and faith even when defeat seems certain. Oprah, now fully engaged and no longer skeptical, asked a penetrating question, but isn't that just positive thinking dressed up as faith? What makes it specifically spiritual rather than just psychological resilience? This question opened up one of the most enlightening exchanges of the entire interview. Stallone responded by explaining that Rocky's faith was explicitly directed toward something transcendent. Before every fight, Rocky crosses himself and says a small prayer. In Rocky III, when he's lost everything and is contemplating retirement, he goes to a chapel to pray. These aren't just superstitious rituals or psychological coping mechanisms. They're genuine acts of communion with something Rocky believes is greater than himself. The distinction Stallone was making resonated deeply with theologians who later analyzed the interview. Professor Michael Harrison of Yale Divinity School wrote an op-ed explaining that Rocky represents what Christian theologian Paul Tillich called ultimate concern, the recognition that there are transcendent realities that give meaning to our finite struggles. Rocky's simple prayers before fights aren't theological statements. They're existential acknowledgments that his life and struggles are part of something larger than himself. This kind of faith, Harrison argued, is actually more intellectually robust than many sophisticated theological systems because it's rooted in lived experience rather than abstract speculation. Stallone also addressed the criticism that Rocky's faith seems to promise worldly success, that he prays and then wins fights, suggesting a transactional relationship with God. He vehemently rejected this interpretation, pointing out that Rocky loses as many crucial fights as he wins. Rocky loses to Apollo in the first film. He loses to Clubber Lang in Rocky III. He loses, in a sense, in Rocky V when he's forced to retire due to brain damage. The faith Rocky has isn't about guaranteeing victory. It's about guaranteeing that defeat won't be the end of the story. It's about resurrection, getting up again, starting over, finding new meaning when the old meaning has been destroyed. This, Stallone argued, is the core of not just Christian theology, but of many wisdom traditions around the world. The conversation then turned to how Rocky's faith manifests in his relationships. Stallone pointed out that Rocky's most faithful act isn't something he does in the ring. It's his unwavering loyalty to Adrian, his commitment to his son, his refusal to abandon Paulie despite Paulie's alcoholism and verbal abuse, his mentorship of Tommy Gunn, even when Tommy betrays him. These acts of faithfulness, of keeping covenant even when it's costly, are expressions of Rocky's deepest beliefs about how life should be lived. His faith isn't compartmentalized into religious moments. It permeates everything he does, every relationship he maintains, every choice he makes. Oprah, now deeply moved, shared that she was beginning to understand something she had missed in her own spiritual journey. She had spent years exploring complex spiritual systems, studying with gurus and reading sacred texts from multiple traditions. But somewhere along the way, she admitted, she had lost touch with the kind of simple, direct faith that Rocky embodied. She had become so focused on understanding spirituality that she had forgotten what it meant to simply believe, to simply trust, to simply pray without needing to analyze every aspect of the experience. This confession created an incredibly vulnerable moment on live television, with one of the most powerful women in media admitting that a fictional boxer had taught her something her years of spiritual seeking had obscured. Comment below and share. What does faith mean to you? Is it simple or complex? Let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from. The exact moment when Oprah's perspective shifted was almost tangible. Viewers watching at home would later report that they could see it happen in real time. like watching clouds part to reveal the sun. It occurred about 23 minutes into the conversation, right after Stallone finished telling a story about visiting a children's hospital while preparing for Rocky 5. He had met a young boy with terminal cancer, whose room was covered with Rocky posters. The boy told Stallone that when the pain got really bad and he wanted to give up, he would imagine himself as Rocky, getting up off the canvas one more time. The boy said that Rocky's faith, his belief that tomorrow could be better even when today was terrible, kept him going through chemotherapy, through nights of agony, through the fear of dying. The boy passed away 3 weeks after that meeting, but his mother later wrote to Stallone saying that her son died with peace, believing he was going somewhere good, inspired by a fictional boxer's simple faith. As Stallone finished this story, his voice breaking with emotion, the camera zoomed in on Oprah's face. The transformation was remarkable. The knowing smile was gone. The slight air of superiority that sometimes accompanies great intelligence and accomplishment had evaporated. In its place was something raw and real, tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with recognition. She later said in interviews that in that moment, she realized she had been guilty of intellectual pride, of assuming that because she had studied spirituality extensively, she understood it better than someone with a simple faith. But the truth that hit her was devastating in its clarity. That boy didn't need complex theology in his hospital room. He needed what Rocky offered: simple, unshakable faith that love is stronger than death, that courage matters more than circumstances, and that believing in something beyond yourself can transform suffering into meaning. What happened next was even more extraordinary. Instead of trying to maintain her composure as she usually did, Oprah let herself feel everything she was feeling in front of millions of viewers. She admitted, on live television, that she had been wrong to laugh. She said, "I'm so sorry. I thought I was beyond needing simple faith. I thought I had graduated to something more sophisticated. But you've just shown me that I've been missing the point entirely. Rocky's faith isn't simple because it's unsophisticated. It's simple because it's true. And truth doesn't need to be complicated to be profound." This admission, coming from someone of Oprah's stature and influence, was itself an act of faith. Faith that vulnerability wouldn't diminish her but would actually make her more human, more relatable, more real. The studio audience erupted in applause, not the polite, obligatory applause that television audiences often provide, but genuine, emotional applause that went on for nearly a full minute. People weren't just clapping for Oprah's humility. They were applauding because they saw themselves in her journey. How many of us have become so sophisticated in our thinking that we've lost touch with simple truths? How many of us have accumulated so much knowledge that we've forgotten what it means to simply believe? How many of us have laughed at others' faith, only to realize later that we were laughing at the very thing we needed most? Oprah then did something unprecedented in her career. She asked Stallone if they could pray together right there on television. Not a vague, spiritually ambiguous prayer designed to offend no one, but a real prayer, the kind Rocky might pray. Stallone, clearly moved beyond words, took her hands and bowed his head. The cameras didn't cut away. The producers didn't go to commercial. For almost 2 minutes, one of the most powerful women in media and one of Hollywood's most iconic actors prayed together on live television, with an audience of millions watching in stunned silence. Stallone's prayer was indeed simple, thanking God for second chances, for the ability to get up after being knocked down, for bringing people into our lives who challenge us to be better than we thought we could be. It was a Rocky prayer through and through. When they finished, Oprah looked directly into the camera and said something that would be replayed in churches and inspirational videos for years to come. If you're watching this, and you've been told that your faith is too simple, too unsophisticated, too naive, don't you believe it? Real faith, the kind that changes lives and heals hearts and gives people the courage to face another day, that faith doesn't need a PhD to understand. It just needs to be real. And Rocky Balboa's faith? It's as real as it gets. The applause that followed was deafening, with the studio audience giving a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this moment was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Multiple crew members later reported that Oprah stayed in the studio for over an hour after the interview, talking with Stallone about faith, about life, about the ways we all lose touch with what matters most. She apparently told him that this interview had changed her, that she couldn't continue hosting her show the same way she had been. She needed to get back to the simple truths that had inspired her in the first place. Before the fame, before the empire, before the sophistication, she needed to remember what it felt like to simply believe without needing to analyze every aspect of belief. The impact of this moment extended far beyond the studio. Within hours, her Rocky faith was trending worldwide, but now with a different tone. Instead of people arguing about whether Oprah had been right or wrong to laugh, they were sharing their own stories of rediscovering simple faith. Ministers reported record attendance at midweek services. Bookstores couldn't keep copies of the Bible in stock. Gyms saw membership spikes from people inspired to get up and fight for their lives the way Rocky fought. Most importantly, countless individuals reached out to people they had hurt with their skepticism, apologizing and asking to hear about the faith they had dismissed. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment that completely changed your perspective on faith? Tell us your story and where you're watching from. Let's inspire each other. The cultural shockwaves from Oprah's interview with Sylvester Stallone rippled across America and eventually the world in ways that no one could have anticipated. Within 24 hours, the clip had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms, making it one of the most watched pieces of content in television history. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only a fraction of the story. What was truly remarkable was how this single interview managed to pierce through the usual cultural divides and create a genuine, nationwide conversation about faith, humility, and what it means to believe in something greater than yourself in an increasingly cynical world. News outlets across the political spectrum covered the interview, each finding different aspects to highlight. Conservative media praised Oprah's willingness to admit she had been wrong and to acknowledge the value of traditional faith expressions. Progressive outlets focused on the interview's message about respecting different forms of spirituality and not dismissing beliefs that might seem unsophisticated at first glance. Religious publications of all denominations wrote extensively about Rocky Balboa as an unexpected evangelistic tool, while secular humanist magazines engaged seriously with the question of whether faith requires supernatural belief or can be found in purely human resilience and connection. What made the cultural moment particularly significant was its timing. America in 2025 was a nation deeply divided along political, cultural, and religious lines. Conversations about faith had become fraught with tension, often devolving into arguments about who was truly righteous and who was deceived. Into this fractured landscape came a moment of genuine vulnerability and connection between two cultural icons, one representing traditional Hollywood masculinity and working-class values, the other embodying self-made success and spiritual seeking. Their ability to find common ground around the simple faith of a fictional boxer suggested that perhaps the divides weren't as insurmountable as they seemed. Universities organized symposiums to discuss the interview and its implications. Harvard Divinity School hosted a panel titled Rocky Balboa and the Theology of Resilience that was standing room only. Yale's philosophy department engaged in a spirited debate about whether Rocky's faith was genuinely philosophical or merely psychologically beneficial. At Georgetown, Catholic theologians discussed how Rocky represented a kind of folk Catholicism that the institutional church had sometimes dismissed but that remained vital and powerful in many communities. These academic conversations, far from being ivory tower abstractions, were being followed by thousands of people online who were hungry for deeper understanding of what had moved them so profoundly about the interview. Perhaps even more significantly, the interview sparked conversations in places where faith was rarely discussed so openly. Corporate boardrooms began including discussions about values and belief in their leadership training. Sports teams brought in chaplains not just for ceremonial purposes, but to have genuine conversations about what the athletes believed and how those beliefs shaped their performance. Schools created spaces for students to discuss faith and doubt without feeling like they had to conform to a particular religious tradition. The interview had somehow made it socially acceptable again to talk about what you believe and why you believe it, even in secular spaces that had long avoided such conversations. The entertainment industry, never one to miss a cultural moment, responded in various ways. Several major studios greenlit faith-based films, not the preachy kind that had often failed at the box office, but stories about ordinary people whose faith carried them through extraordinary circumstances. Musicians across genres wrote songs inspired by the interview, with themes of getting up after being knocked down and believing when belief seemed foolish. Even comedians, who had long treated religious faith as an easy target for mockery, began crafting material that was more nuanced, exploring their own complicated relationships with belief, rather than simply dismissing it as stupid or harmful. Social media became a surprisingly positive space for once, as people shared their rocky moments, times when faith, however they defined it, had gotten them through impossible situations. A veteran posted about how Rocky helped him deal with PTSD, giving him a framework for understanding that being knocked down didn't make you weak, it made you human, and getting up again made you strong. A teacher shared how she showed Rocky clips to her students in an underserved community, using the films to teach resilience and the importance of believing in yourself when no one else does. A pastor in Detroit reported that his church, which had been struggling with declining attendance, was now packed every Sunday with young people who wanted to talk about the kind of authentic, lived faith that Rocky represented. But the impact wasn't just in America. The interview went viral globally, with people in countries around the world connecting with its universal message. In Brazil, favela youth started Rocky-themed fitness programs combined with mentorship and faith discussions. In the Philippines, communities devastated by natural disasters found inspiration in Rocky's persistence. In South Africa, the interview was used in reconciliation workshops, with participants discussing how faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in justice, was necessary for healing deep societal wounds. Rocky Balboa, a working-class Philadelphia boxer created almost 50 years earlier, had somehow become a global symbol of resilient faith in the 21st century. The interview also impacted how spiritual leaders approached their work. Ministers, rabbis, imams, and Buddhist teachers reported that their congregations were asking for more Rocky-style faith, authentic, accessible, focused on real-life application, rather than abstract theology. Religious institutions that had been hemorrhaging members, especially younger people, found that using cultural touchstones like Rocky to discuss eternal truths was far more effective than traditional approaches. The interview had shown that you didn't have to choose between sophistication and simplicity, between intellectual rigor and emotional authenticity. Rocky's faith worked precisely because it integrated all these elements in a way that felt real, rather than manufactured. Tell us in the comments, how has this story impacted you? What's your takeaway from Oprah and Rocky's powerful moment? Don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. To understand why Rocky Balboa's simple faith resonates so profoundly with so many people, we need to explore the psychological mechanisms that make belief such a powerful force in human life. The interview between Oprah and Stallone inadvertently opened up a fascinating conversation among psychologists, neuroscientists, and researchers about why stories like Rocky's, stories of faith enabling superhuman perseverance, have such universal appeal. What they discovered was that Rocky's faith wasn't just spiritually significant, it was psychologically optimal for human flourishing in ways that more complex belief systems sometimes aren't. Dr. Angela Chen, a clinical psychologist at Stanford who specializes in resilience and trauma recovery, published a widely read article analyzing the interview from a psychological perspective. She argued that Rocky's faith activated multiple psychological mechanisms simultaneously. It provided a sense of meaning and purpose, answering the why question that Viktor Frankl identified as crucial for human survival. It created an external locus of hope, preventing the despair that comes from feeling like you're the only resource you have. And it established a narrative framework that transformed suffering from meaningless pain into purposeful struggle. This combination, Chen argued, was psychologically more powerful than positive thinking alone because it provided both emotional support and cognitive structure. The concept of learned helplessness, first identified by psychologist Martin Seligman, helps explain why faith becomes so crucial in situations like Rocky's. Learned helplessness occurs when people experience repeated adversity and come to believe that nothing they do matters, that they're powerless to change their circumstances. This psychological state leads to depression, anxiety, and giving up. Faith, particularly the kind Rocky embodied, is a direct antidote to learned helplessness because it insists that what you do matters, that your efforts have meaning, and that even if you can't control outcomes, you can control how you show up and keep showing up. Rocky's faith wasn't passive resignation. It was active, muscular belief that created psychological agency even in situations where external agency was limited. Neuroscience research has also shed light on why faith and belief have such powerful effects on human performance and well-being. Studies using fMRI technology have shown that religious faith and deeply held beliefs activate the brain's reward centers, releasing dopamine and creating feelings of pleasure and motivation. But beyond just making us feel good, faith also appears to reduce activity in the brain's stress and fear centers, the amygdala, and related structures. This neurological effect explains why people of faith often show greater resilience in the face of adversity. When Rocky crosses himself before a fight, he's not just performing a superstitious ritual, he's literally changing his brain chemistry in ways that make him calmer, more focused, and more capable of enduring pain. The interview also highlighted something psychologists call sacred framing, the tendency for people to perform better and persist longer when they view their tasks as connected to something transcendent rather than merely personal. Research has consistently shown that people who frame their work as serving a higher purpose, whether God, family, community, or an ideal, show greater persistence, higher pain tolerance, and better overall performance than those who view their efforts as purely self-interested. Rocky's faith provided exactly this kind of sacred framing. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting to prove that God doesn't make junk, that even the most unlikely person can have dignity and worth, that love and loyalty matter more than talent and privilege. Another psychological concept illuminated by the interview was what researchers call benefit finding, or post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people who experience severe adversity sometimes emerge stronger and more resilient than they were before. Faith appears to be a key mediator of this process. People with strong faith frameworks are more likely to find meaning in their suffering, to view their struggles as part of a larger narrative rather than random cruelty, and to emerge from difficulties with a sense of having been refined rather than merely damaged. Rocky embodied this perfectly. Every beating he took, every loss he experienced, every time he was knocked down became part of his story of resilience rather than evidence of his inadequacy. The simplicity of Rocky's faith also had psychological advantages that more complex belief systems sometimes lack. Cognitive load theory suggests that when we're under stress, our capacity for complex thinking diminishes dramatically. In crisis moments, we need beliefs and frameworks that are simple enough to hold on to even when our cognitive resources are depleted. Rocky's faith was exactly this kind of belief, simple enough to remember when you're exhausted and beaten, profound enough to provide real sustenance. When you're face down on the canvas with your body screaming at you to stay down, you don't need a sophisticated theological argument. You need a simple belief that you can and should get up one more time. The interview also touched on what psychologists call social proof and modeling, the tendency for people to adopt behaviors and beliefs they see working for others, especially others they admire or relate to. Rocky worked as a faith model precisely because he was relatable. He wasn't a saint or a prophet. He was a regular guy from a rough neighborhood who happened to have faith that carried him through extraordinary circumstances. This made his faith feel accessible and achievable to ordinary people struggling with their own battles. If Rocky could believe, and that belief could transform his life, maybe their belief could transform their lives too. Developmental psychologists have noted that Rocky's faith also speaks to something deep in human psychology, the need for a secure attachment figure. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, suggests that humans have an innate need to feel securely connected to something or someone that provides safety and support. For Rocky, faith in God served this attachment function, providing a sense that he wasn't ultimately alone, that there was a benevolent force that cared about him even when he was at his lowest. This psychological need for secure attachment doesn't disappear in adulthood. It simply gets transferred to different figures and frameworks. Rocky's faith provided that secure base from which he could venture out and take enormous risks, knowing that even if he failed, he wasn't ultimately abandoned or without value. The interview with Oprah also revealed something about the psychology of conversion and perspective change. Research on attitude change and persuasion shows that people are most likely to change deeply held beliefs when they experience a combination of emotional arousal and cognitive dissonance, when their feelings and their thoughts are both engaged and challenged simultaneously. Oprah's transformation during the interview was a textbook example of this process. Stallone's stories created powerful emotional arousal, while simultaneously challenging Oprah's cognitive framework that sophisticated spirituality was superior to simple faith. This combination created the conditions for genuine perspective change. and we witnessed it happening in real time. Finally, the psychological concept of flow helps explain why Rocky's faith-fueled performances were so compelling. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi identified flow as a state of optimal experience where people are fully immersed in an activity, performing at their best, and experiencing deep satisfaction. Research shows that people are more likely to experience flow when they're engaged in activities that have clear goals, immediate feedback, and are connected to their deepest values. Rocky's fights embodied all these elements, with his faith providing the value framework that made the experience meaningful rather than merely painful. When people watched Rocky fight with faith-fueled determination, they weren't just watching boxing. They were watching someone in a state of optimal human experience, and that inspired them to seek similar states in their own lives. Comment below and share. From a psychological perspective, when has belief or faith helped you push through when logic said to quit? Tell us your story and where you're watching from around the world. Months after the interview aired, the impact of that single conversation between Oprah Winfrey and Sylvester Stallone continued to reverberate through culture in ways both large and small. What could have been just another viral moment, consumed quickly and forgotten faster, instead became something more enduring, a cultural touchstone that people returned to again and again when they needed inspiration, when their faith was being tested, or when they simply needed to be reminded that simple beliefs can be profoundly powerful. The legacy of that interview speaks to humanity's deep hunger for authentic faith and the courage to believe even when the world says you're foolish for doing so. One of the most tangible aspects of the interview's legacy has been the dramatic increase in faith-based mentorship programs across the country. Inspired by Rocky's combination of physical training and spiritual fortitude, hundreds of new programs emerged that paired gym workouts with faith discussions, boxing training with character development, and physical challenges with spiritual growth. These programs, many operating in underserved communities, reported remarkable results: decreased violence, increased school attendance, improved family relationships, and most importantly, young people who had lost hope finding reasons to believe in themselves and in a better future. The Rocky Method, as it came to be called, demonstrated that faith wasn't just something you talked about in church, it was something you lived out in every arena of life, including the gym. Educational institutions also felt the impact. Multiple universities added courses examining the intersection of popular culture, faith, and human resilience, using the Rocky films and the Oprah interview as primary texts. High school English classes began including Rocky in their curriculum, analyzing the films through literary, philosophical, and theological lenses. Students who had never thought seriously about faith found themselves engaged in deep conversations about what they believed and why. Teachers reported that using Rocky as a conversation starter made discussions about faith and meaning accessible to students who might have been resistant to more traditional religious instruction. The character's blue-collar authenticity and lived faith provided a bridge between academic study and real-world application. The mental health community embraced the interview's insights as well. Therapists and counselors began incorporating discussions of faith, defined broadly to include various forms of belief and meaning-making, into their treatment approaches. The recognition that faith could be a crucial psychological resource, not just a religious preference, opened up new avenues for helping clients develop resilience. Support groups for everything from addiction recovery to grief counseling to chronic illness management reported that the Rocky model of faith, simple, direct, action-oriented, resonated powerfully with people who were struggling. The idea that you could pray simple prayers and then get up and fight, rather than waiting for God to fight for you, empowered people who had felt passive and helpless in the face of their challenges. The business world, surprisingly, also drew lessons from the interview. Leadership consultants began teaching Rocky leadership, the idea that authentic leadership requires faith not just in yourself, but in something larger than yourself and in the people you're leading. Corporate executives shared how the interview had challenged them to lead with more vulnerability and authenticity, to admit when they were wrong, as Oprah had done, and to respect the deeply held beliefs of their employees, even when those beliefs seemed simple or unsophisticated. Several Fortune 500 companies reported that creating space for employees to discuss their values and what gave their work meaning led to higher engagement, better retention, and stronger corporate culture. The entertainment industry's response to the interview proved to be one of its most significant legacies. The success of the viral moment led to a renaissance in authentic storytelling about faith and resilience. Studios that had been afraid to tackle religious themes seriously, as opposed to using them for horror or comedy, began greenlighting projects that explored faith with the same nuanced complexity that Stallone had demonstrated in his discussion of Rocky. These weren't preachy films designed only for religious audiences. They were universal stories about human struggle and what sustains us when everything else fails. Several of these films became both critical and commercial successes, proving that audiences were hungry for stories that took faith seriously without being simplistic or propagandistic. Individual lives were transformed in countless ways, many of which were documented through letters, social media posts, and testimonials. A man who had been planning to end his life watched the interview and decided to give life one more round. Like Rocky always did, he sought help, got treatment for depression, reconnected with his faith, and became a suicide prevention advocate who explicitly credited the interview with saving his life. A woman who had abandoned her faith after a devastating loss watched Oprah's vulnerable moment of recognition and realized that perhaps her anger at God was actually evidence that her faith was still alive. You can't be angry at something you don't believe in. She returned to her church community and eventually became a grief counselor who helps others navigate faith through suffering. Athletes at every level, from youth sports to professional leagues, adopted Rocky's approach to faith and competition. Pre-game prayers became less about asking God for victory and more about asking for strength, courage, and the ability to honor the game regardless of outcome. Coaches began teaching that faith wasn't a guarantee of winning, but a guarantee that losing wouldn't be the end of the story. Sports psychologists noted that this reframing dramatically reduced performance anxiety and increased resilience, with athletes performing better when they weren't carrying the burden of believing that their worth depended on outcomes they couldn't fully control. The interview's legacy also extended to interfaith dialogue and religious understanding. The fact that Rocky's Catholicism was presented as both specific and universal, rooted in a particular tradition, but expressing truths that transcended that tradition, provided a model for how people of different faiths could honor their distinct beliefs, while recognizing shared human experiences. Religious leaders from various traditions began using the interview in interfaith events, pointing out that while they might pray to different names and follow different practices, the essential human need for faith, meaning, and resilience was universal. This approach reduced defensiveness and increased curiosity, with people becoming more interested in learning about others' faith, rather than arguing about whose faith was correct. Perhaps the most profound aspect of the interview's lasting legacy was how it empowered ordinary people to own their faith without apology or embarrassment. In an era where public expressions of faith often felt either aggressively evangelical or apologetically diffident, Rocky's straightforward belief, and Oprah's eventual embrace of it, gave people permission to be open about what they believed without needing to defend it intellectually or impose it on others. Faith became something you could simply live, the way Rocky lived it, and let the authenticity of your life be the testimony. This shift was subtle but significant, creating space for genuine spiritual conversations in workplaces, schools, families, and friendships where such conversations had long been taboo. The interview also sparked a revival of interest in the Rocky films themselves, with new generations discovering the franchise and older fans revisiting it with fresh eyes. Film scholars noted that the movies had always contained sophisticated explorations of faith, masculinity, loyalty, and human dignity, but these themes had often been overlooked in favor of focusing on the boxing sequences and training montages. The interview reframed how people watched the films, encouraging them to pay attention to the quiet moments. Rocky praying in the chapel, talking with Adrian about faith and fear, showing kindness to people who had shown him none. These moments, it turned out, were just as important as the dramatic fight sequences, and in some ways more important because they showed where Rocky's strength actually came from. Years after the interview, both Oprah and Stallone continued to reference that moment as pivotal in their own lives. Oprah incorporated more discussions of simple, authentic faith into her media projects, moving away from New Age spirituality that sometimes felt more focused on self-actualization than on transcendent connection. Stallone began speaking more openly about his own faith journey and how Rocky had been in many ways his testimony, a way of sharing what he believed without preaching. The mutual respect and genuine connection they demonstrated during that interview became a model for how public figures could discuss faith in ways that were neither preachy nor dismissive, neither simplistic nor needlessly complex. The ultimate legacy of the interview might be this: it reminded millions of people that faith, real, lived, authentic faith, doesn't require sophisticated articulation or intellectual defense. It requires courage, consistency, and the willingness to get up one more time than you've been knocked down. Rocky Balboa, a fictional character created almost 50 years ago, became an unlikely saint for the modern age precisely because his faith was so uncomplicated and yet so powerful. And Oprah Winfrey, by having the humility to recognize what she had missed and the courage to admit it publicly, demonstrated that it's never too late to embrace simple truths that can transform your life. Together, they created a moment that will continue inspiring people for generations to come, reminding us all that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes in the simplest packages, and that faith, whatever form it takes in your life, might be the most important thing you carry into the ring. Final call to action. This is your moment. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? City, state, country. Let's see how far this message has spread. What's your biggest takeaway from this powerful story? When has simple faith gotten you through an impossible situation? Are you Team Oprah for her humility, or Team Rocky for his unwavering belief? Tag someone who needs to hear this message today. Let's build the most inspiring comment section on the internet. Share your Rocky moment, tell your faith story, and let's encourage each other. Remember, it only takes one comment to inspire thousands. Will you be that inspiration today? Drop your comment now, and let's create a movement of faith and resilience together.